Chapter 2. At the head of the breakfast table sat Mr. Pendyce, eating methodically. He was somewhat silent, as became a man who has just read family prayers, but about that silence and the pile of half-opened letters on his right was a hint of autocracy. Be informal. Do what you like. Dress as you like. Sit where you like. Eat what you like. Drink tea or coffee. But each glance of his eyes, each sentence of his sparing, semi-genial talk seemed to repeat that but. At the foot of the breakfast table sat Mrs. Pendyce behind a silver urn which emitted a gentle steam. Her hands worked without ceasing amongst cups, and while they worked, her lips worked too in spasmodic utterances that never had any reference to herself. Pushed a little to her left, and entirely neglected, lay a piece of dry toast on a small white plate. Twice she took it up, buttered a bit of it, and put it down again. Once she rested, and her eyes, which fell on Mrs. Bellow, seemed to say, "How very charming you look, my dear." Then, taking up the sugar tongs, she began again. On the long sideboard, covered with a white cloth, reposed a number of edibles only to be found amongst that portion of the community which breeds creatures for its own devouring. At one end of this row of viands was a large game pile with a triangular gap in the pastry. At the other, on two oval dishes, lay 4 cold partridges in various stages of decomposition. Behind them, a silver basket of open-work design was occupied by 3 bunches of black, 1 bunch of white grapes, and a silver grape cutter, which performed no function, it was so blunt, but once belonged to a Tutteridge and wore their crest. No servants were in the room, but the sideboard was now and again opened and something brought in, and this suggested that behind the door, persons were collected, only waiting to be called upon. It was in fact as though Mr. Pendyce had said, "A butler and 2 footmen at least could hand you things, but this is a simple country house." At times a male guest rose, napkin in hand, and said to a lady, "Can I get you anything from the sideboard?" Being refused, he went and filled his own plate. 3 dogs, 2 fox terriers, and a decrepit Skye circled around uneasily, smelling at the visitors' napkins, and there went up a hum of talk in which sentences like these could be distinguished. "Rip and stand that, by the wood. Do you remember your rocketing woodcock last year, Jerry? And the dear old squire never touched a feather. Did you, squire? Dick, Dick, bad dog, come and do your tricks. Trust, trust. Paid for. Isn't he rather a darling?" On Mr. Pendyce's foot, or by the side of his chair, whence he could see what was being eaten, sat the spaniel John, and now and then Mr. Pendyce, taking a small portion of something between his finger and thumb, would say, "John, make a good breakfast, Sir James. I always say a half-breakfasted man is no good." And Mrs. Pendyce, her eyebrows lifted, would look anxiously up and down the table, murmuring, "Another cup, dear. Let me see. Are you sugar?" When all had finished, a silence fell, as if each sought to get away from what he had been eating, as if each felt he had been engaged in an unworthy practice. Then Mr. Pendyce, finishing his last grape, wiped his mouth. "You've got a quarter of an hour, gentlemen. We start at 10:15. Mrs. Pendyce, left seated with a vague, erosonic smile, ate 1 mouthful of her buttered toast, now very old and leathery, gave the rest to the dear dogs, and called, "George, you want a new shooting tie, dear boy. That green one's quite faded. I've been meaning to get some silks down for ages. Have you had any news of your horse this morning?" "Yes, blacksmith says he's fit as a fiddle." "I do so hope he'll win that race for you. Your Uncle Hubert once lost £4,000 over the Rutlandshire. I remember perfectly. My father had to pay it. I'm so glad you don't bet, dear boy." "My dear mother, I do bet." "Oh, George, I hope not much. For goodness sake, don't tell your father. He's like all the Pendances, can't bear a risk." "My dear mother, I'm not likely to, but as a matter of fact, there is no risk. I stand to win a lot of money to nothing." "But George, is that right?" "Of course it's all right." "Oh, well, I don't understand." Mrs. Pendyce dropped her eyes. A flush came into her white cheeks. She looked up again and said quickly, "George, I should like just a little bet on your horse. A real bet, say about a sovereign." George Pendance's creed permitted the show of no emotion. He smiled. "All right, Mother, I'll put it on for you. It'll be about 8-1. Does that mean that if he wins, I shall get 8? George nodded. Mrs. Pendyce looked abstractedly at his tie. She'd think it might be 2 sovereigns. One seems very little to lose, because I do so want him to win. Isn't Helen Ballou perfectly charming this morning? It's delightful to see a woman look her best in the morning." George turned to hide the colour in his cheeks. "She looks fresh enough, certainly." Mrs. Pendyce glanced up at him. There was a touch of quizzicality in one of her lifted eyebrows. "I mustn't keep you, dear. You'll be late for the shooting." Mr. Pendyce, a sportsman of the old school, who still kept pointers, which, in the teeth of modern fashion, he was unable to employ, set his face against the use of 2 guns. "Any man who cares to shoot at worsted skeins must do with 1 gun, as my dear old father had to do before me. He'll get a good day's sport, no barn door birds, for he encouraged his pheasants to remain lean that they might fly the better. But don't let him expect one of these bateaux, sheer butchery I call them." He was excessively fond of birds. It was in fact his hobby, and he had collected under glass cases a prodigious number of specimens of those species which are in danger of becoming extinct, having really, in some Pendyce sort of way, a feeling that by this practice he was doing them a good turn, championing them, as it were, to a world that would soon be unable to look upon them in the flesh. He wished, too, that his collection should become an integral part of the estate and be passed on to his son and his son's son after him. "Look at this Dartford warbler. Beautiful little creature, getting rarer every day. I had the greatest difficulty in procuring this specimen. You wouldn't believe me if I told you what I had to pay for him." Some of his unique birds he had shot himself, having in his youth made expeditions to foreign countries solely with this object. But the greater majority he had been compelled to purchase. In his library were row upon row of books carefully arranged and bearing on this fascinating subject, and his collection of rare, almost extinct birds' eggs was one of the finest in the 3 kingdoms. One egg especially he would point to with pride as the last obtainable of that particular breed. "This was procured by my dear old Gilly Angus out of the bird's very nest. There was just the single egg." The species, he added tenderly, handling the delicate porcelain-like oval in his brown hand covered with very fine blackish hairs, is now extinct. He was in fact a true bird-lover, strongly condemning cockneys or rough, ignorant persons who, with no collections of their own, wantonly destroyed kingfishers or scarce birds of any sort out of pure stupidity. I would have them flogged. He believed that no such bird should be killed except on commission, and to choice, barring such extreme cases as that Dartford warbler, in some foreign country or remoter part of the British Isles. It was indeed illustrative of Mr. Pendance's character and whole point of view that whenever a rare winged stranger appeared on his own estate, it was talked of as an event and preserved alive with the greatest care, in the hope that it might breed and be handed down with the property. But if it were personally known to belong to Mr. Fuller or Lord Quarryman, whose estates abutted on worsted skeins, and there was grave and imminent danger of it going back, it was promptly shot and stuffed, that it might not be lost to posterity. An encounter with another landowner having the same hobby, of whom there were several in his neighbourhood, would upset him for a week, making him strangely morose, and he would at once redouble his efforts to add something rarer than ever to his own collection. His arrangements for shooting were precisely conceived. Little slips of paper with the names of the guns written thereon were placed in a hat, and one by one drawn out again, and this he always did himself. Behind the right wing of the house he held a review of the beaters, who filed before him out of the yard, each with a long stick in his hand and no expression on his face. 5 minutes of directions to the keeper, and then the guns started, carrying their own weapons and a sufficiency of cartridges for the first drive in the old way. A misty radiance clung over the grass as the sun dried the heavy dew. The thrushes hopped and ran and hid themselves, the rooks cawed peacefully in the old elms. At an angle, the game cart, constructed on Mr. Pendyce's own pattern and drawn by a hairy horse in charge of an aged man, made its way slowly to the end of the first beat. George lagged behind, his hands deep in his pockets, drinking in the joy of the tranquil day, the soft bird sounds so clear and friendly, that chorus of wildlife. The scent of the coverts stole to him, and he thought, "What a ripping day for shooting." The squire, wearing a suit carefully colored so that no bird should see him, leather leggings, and a cloth helmet of his own devising, ventilated by many little holes, came up to his son, and the spaniel John, who had a passion for the collection of birds almost equal to his master's, came up too. "Your end gun, George," he said. "You'll get a nice high bird." George felt the ground with his feet and blew a speck of dust off his barrels, and the smell of the oil sent a delicious tremor darting through him. Everything, even Helen Ballou, was forgotten. Then in the silence rose a far-off clamor. A cock-pheasant skimming low, his plumage silken in the sun, dived out of the green and golden spinney, curled to the right, and was lost in undergrowth. Some pigeons passed over at a great height. The tap-tap of sticks beating against trees began. Then with a fitful rushing noise, a pheasant came straight out. George threw up his gun and pulled. The bird stopped in mid-air, jerked forward, and fell headlong into the grass sods with a thud. In the sunlight, the dead bird lay, and a smirk of triumph played on George's lips. He was feeling the joy of life. During his covert shoots, the squire had the habit of recording his impressions in a mental notebook. He put special marks against such as missed, or shot birds behind the waist, or placed lead in them to the detriment of their market value, or broke only one leg of a hare at a time, causing the animal to cry like a tortured child, which some men do not like, or such as, anxious for fame, claimed dead creatures that they had not shot, or peopled the next beat with imaginary slain, or too frequently wiped an important neighbor's eye, or shot too many beaters in the legs. Against this evidence, however, he unconsciously weighed the more undeniable social facts, such as the title of Winlow's father, Sir James Malden's coverts, which must also presently be shot, Thomas Brandwhite's position in the financial world, General Pendyce's relationship to himself, and the importance of the English Church. Against Foxley alone he could put no marks. The fellow destroyed everything that came within reach with utter precision, and this was perhaps fortunate, for Foxley had neither title, coverts, position, nor cloth. And the squire weighed one thing else besides, the pleasure of giving them all a good day's sport, for his heart was kind. The sun had fallen well behind the home wood when the guns stood waiting for the last drive of the day. From the keeper's cottage in the hollow, where late threads of crimson clung in the brown network of Virginia creeper, rose a mist of wood smoke, dispersed upon the breeze. Sound there was none, only that faint stir, the far, far callings of men and beasts and birds that never quite dies of a country evening. High above the wood, some startled pigeons were still wheeling, no other life in sight, but a gleam of sunlight stole down the side of the covert and laid a burnish on the turned leaves till the whole wood seemed quivering with magic. Out of that quivering wood, a wounded rabbit had stolen and was dying. It lay on its side on the slope of a tussock of grass, its hind legs drawn under it, its forelegs raised like the hands of a praying child. Motionless as death, all its remaining life was centered in its black, soft eyes. Uncomplaining, ungrudging, unknowing, with that poor, soft, wandering eye, it was going back to Mother Earth. There, Foxley too someday must go, asking of nature why she had murdered him. Is the story getting interesting? But love doesn't end when the world tells you it should. In the next chapter, the truth will come to light, and one heart will have to break. Watch Part 3, Echoes of a Broken Promise, coming soon on this channel.